Welcome, dear listeners. Imagine steam so thick it could choke an angel. Imagine the sound of boiling water bubbling like the devil's laughter and the sting of lye biting at your nose. Now imagine you're standing over it, bare-armed, half-dizzy, sweat mixing with steam until you can't tell which is which. Welcome to Laundry Day at Fairwick Manor, where white linens gleam like ghosts and the living barely keep up with the dead. Somewhere in that swirling mist is a woman named Agnes Blackwell. And today, as on most days, she's not entirely sure whether she's laundering sheets or her own will to live. Before we begin, be sure to like, share and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now, lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket, and let's travel together, way, way back together. Agnes was born in 1839 in a soot-grey corner of Yorkshire, in a village so small the cows outnumbered people and were probably happier for it. Her father, Thomas, worked the mills until his lungs gave up the idea of breathing, and her mother, Mary, took in mending for the same fine families whose chimneys coughed soot over their cottage. Agnes had 4 younger siblings, all thin as broomsticks, and learned early that survival depended on 2 things: strong wrists and a stronger stomach. She could scrub a hem by the time she was 7 and knew the difference between fine linen and cheap cotton by touch before she learned to spell her own name. When her mother died, scalded by a toppled kettle as fate would have it, Agnes was 15 and already halfway through a life she hadn't agreed to live. The manor up the road needed a new laundress, and she was recommended for her reliable hands. They said it like a compliment. By 17, she'd earned herself a room in the servants' quarters, a damp corner with a single cot and a view of the laundry yard, where sheets flapped like surrender flags in the wind. There were whispers of marriage once, a stable boy named Daniel with kind eyes and missing teeth, but he was caught stealing candles and transported. Lucky him, she muttered the day he was led away in chains. By 21, Agnes ran the laundry house like a general. She had 2 girls under her, both orphans, both learning fast that boiling lye didn't forgive mistakes. Mondays were the worst, mountain peaks of bed linen, the stains of every human sin, wine, sweat, blood, birth, death. The water hissed like it resented them. Agnes stirred it with a wooden paddle taller than she was, her arms red to the elbows, her skin peppered with burns that never healed right. Sometimes she imagined the clothes whispering as they boiled, tiny voices rising in the steam, the confessions of the upstairs people who never said thank you. Lunch was a fantasy. They ate when the firewood ran low or someone fainted, whichever came first. The wash-house air was thick enough to drink, and she often did, unintentionally. There was the tang of lye on her lips, the constant hiss of boiling water, the faint hum of hymn tunes she muttered to keep from cursing the Almighty. By evening, when the last batch was hung to dry on long ropes stretched across the courtyard, the rows of white sheets looked like a field of ghosts bowing to her, silent, obedient, and utterly drained of life. Much like herself, her back ached as if her spine were being slowly wrung out along with the linens. The younger maids teased that Agnes could fold a sheet so crisp you could cut your finger on it. She didn't laugh. Blood comes out in the second boil, she told them. Dark humour was her armour, and she polished it daily. Once, when a new scullery maid asked if the stains of the dead ever truly vanished, Agnes smirked and said, "Only if you boil long enough to join them." At night, when the manor slept, she stayed awake listening to the creak of the rafters, the whisper of wind against the drying lines, and the occasional thump of something small, sometimes a dropped sheet, sometimes a rat, sometimes a sound that reminded her uncomfortably of her mother's final kettle crash. She'd dream of water, always water, flooding, scalding, swallowing her whole, and wake to find her hands clenched as if wringing an invisible garment. The doctor called it fatigue of the nerves. She called it life. The years passed in loops of soap and sorrow. She became known as Old Blackwell before she was 40, though she still had most of her teeth and all her bitterness. Children born upstairs became adults with families of their own, and still Agnes washed their sheets. The housekeeper once told her she was indispensable. Agnes thought about throwing herself into the boiling vat just to test that theory. When storms rolled in from the moors, lightning flashing against the lines of drying linen, the courtyard looked alive with white phantoms writhing in the wind. The other maids would huddle inside, whispering about ghosts. Agnes would stand at the door, watching, arms folded, and mutter, "If they're ghosts, they've got better company out there than in here." She'd survived every fever, every burn, every winter frost that split the water buckets, and still, the next morning, she'd light the fire and start the boil again. The first year at Fairwick Manor nearly broke her. The laundry house stood at the far edge of the estate, beside the stables and the pig yard, as though even the building itself had been banished for smelling too much of effort. The walls sweated in summer, froze in winter, and the air always tasted faintly of soap ash and despair. Agnes learned to wake before dawn, before the rooster, before thought itself, because if she thought too long, she'd stay in bed and never get up again. She'd light the furnace, haul buckets from the pump, and curse softly at the ice crusting her pail. Sometimes she swore the pump water had more life in it than she did. Her hands, once small and girlish, became raw maps of the work she did, cracked, swollen, lined with burns that no salve could soothe. The skin around her nails grew hard as horn. The cook, Mrs. Penbury, liked to say you could tell a good servant by her hands. "You've the hands of a saint, Agnes," she'd say, and Agnes would nod politely, thinking if sainthood meant permanent disfigurement, she'd rather be a sinner with smooth fingers and a warm bed. By 19, she'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of the manor, the dull clang of breakfast trays upstairs, the shouts from the stable boys, the echoing toll of the laundry bell summoning her to begin again. On fine days she carried the wet linen to the courtyard, where the wind would whip it into wild shapes, each one a pale, billowing thing that looked almost alive. She joked to the younger girls that if they weren't careful, one of those sheets would wrap around them and carry them off. They'd laugh nervously, but later she'd catch them glancing at the fluttering fabric with real unease. There were moments of strange beauty in her days, though she'd never admit it aloud. The sunlight through steam sometimes made a halo around her wrists as she wrung the water out of the linen. She'd hum under her breath, folk tunes her mother used to sing while patching trousers, and for a fleeting second the world didn't feel cruel, only heavy. Then a supervisor would bark her name, and the spell would break like glass underfoot. She lived for small indulgences, a spoonful of treacle when the cook wasn't looking, a quick sit by the open window at dusk, a stolen letter from one of the upstairs rooms that she'd secretly read before tossing into the fire. The letters always smelled faintly of perfume and lies. Agnes liked to imagine herself as the sort of woman who could write one, soft-handed, powdered, lounging in lace while someone else boiled her laundry to keep her decent. "Imagine having sheets white enough to need washing twice a week," she once said, and the girls laughed until one of them fainted from the heat. Not all days were survivable in jest. The lie burns came back with a vengeance that winter. Her wrists turned red and wept clear fluid, her nails blackened at the tips, and still she worked. The overseer, Mr. Catterley, a man with the emotional depth of a laundry paddle, told her to mind her attitude. She almost plunged his hand into the boiling vat just to show him how cleansing it could be. Instead, she smiled sweetly and said, "You're welcome to take over, sir. It'd do wonders for your complexion." The other girls nearly died of suppressed laughter. Catterley didn't speak to her for a week, which was, frankly, the kindest thing he'd ever done for her. Sometimes, on moonlit nights, when the courtyard was quiet and the white sheets swayed like tired souls, Agnes would talk to them. She'd whisper secrets into the damp air, silly things, wishes, half-remembered prayers. "You've seen worse than me," she'd murmur, touching the fabric, "so keep my sins between us, eh?" The wind would tug at the linen in reply, and she'd smile faintly, as if the ghosts approved. There was one evening, a summer one, humid and breathless, when something shifted. She'd been hauling freshly boiled linen alone after the others went in for supper. The sun was setting, and the yard glowed a soft amber. The white sheets caught the light and gleamed like rows of candles. She stopped to rest her back, breathing in the faint perfume of soap and singed cloth. Then she saw it, a shape behind the drying lines. Not quite a shadow, not quite a person. Something that moved wrong, slow and jerky, like a puppet without strings. She blinked. It was gone. Only the wind remained, tugging at the sheets. She told herself it was fatigue, a trick of heat and hunger. But when she turned back toward the laundry house, she noticed one of the sheets had slipped its peg and was lying in the dirt. She stooped to pick it up and found it damp, though it hadn't been wet a moment before. The smell clung to her fingers long after she'd gone to bed. Not lye, not soap. Something faintly sweet like decay wrapped in lavender. She told no one. After all, in a place like Fairwick Manor, the dead were the only ones who truly rested. The next morning, the smell was gone, but Agnes couldn't shake the unease of it. She worked faster than usual, dunking sheets and stirring vats as though she could scald the memory away. The other girls noticed her silence and wisely didn't ask. In the wash-house, silence was often a survival tactic. Noise made you careless, and careless girls ended up burned, blistered, or out of work. Agnes had seen too many bright, giggling girls turn into ghosts of themselves within a season. You came in pink and soft, and before you knew it, the lie had claimed you. The house likes them fresh, she once told a newcomer, but not for long. By 20, she'd mastered the rhythm of drudgery. She could tell the time by the crack of the firewood and predict the weather by how quickly the steam rose from the vats. But no matter how precise her work, something new seemed to settle over her each evening, a heaviness that crept into her bones, as if the manor itself were leaning closer to listen. Some nights she swore she could hear dripping, faint and steady, though all the tubs were empty. The sound seemed to come from the walls, the way a heart beats behind ribs. It was on one of those nights that she met the new scullery boy, Thomas Gray, barely 16, with straw-coloured hair and a grin far too clean for service work. He offered her a handful of gooseberries he'd pilfered from the kitchen garden, and she took them just to remember what sweetness tasted like. "You look like you've never laughed in your life," he'd teased. "I've tried," she said, "but the job keeps ruining the punchline." Still, he made her laugh that evening, an awkward, breathy sound she hadn't heard from her own throat in years. For a while, that was enough to make the long days feel almost survivable. They met often after that, in stolen moments, by the water pump, behind the stables, once even in the laundry house when the others were asleep. He'd trace the scars on her hands, and she'd tell him stories of the village where she grew up, how the fog used to roll in so thick it looked like heaven had fallen to earth. He'd listen as though it mattered, but it was the manor, not fate, that ruled lives here, and kindness had a short lifespan under its roof. Within 3 months, Thomas had been dismissed for idle behaviour and unbecoming familiarity. The cook hinted it wasn't his only offence. Agnes didn't believe her, but she didn't protest either. Protest rarely changed anything. It only made the punishment personal. After he left, she noticed the sheets in the courtyard began tangling more often, twisting around one another like they were caught in invisible arms. She told herself it was just the wind, but once, late at night, she found a sheet lying folded neatly on the ground, as if someone had laid it down with care. No footprints, no wind that night either. She picked it up and froze. It was warm. She stood there in the dark, the white cloth draped over her arms, heart hammering like a fist on a locked door. "Thomas," she whispered, half foolish, half hopeful. Only the rustle of the trees replied. From that night on, the wash-house took on a life of its own. The firewood burned slower, the water seemed to boil colder, and sometimes she swore she saw movement in the rising steam. A flicker, a silhouette, gone before she could blink. She told herself she was tired. The human mind, she reasoned, can see saints in stains if the day's long enough. And yet, one evening she was alone again, finishing the last load. The others had gone to supper. The manor beyond the courtyard loomed dark except for a few golden windows. As she lifted a freshly boiled sheet, her hand slipped and it fell back into the vat, splashing scalding water onto her arm. She gasped, swore and jerked it free, but then froze. Something had brushed her wrist. Not fabric, not water, a touch, gentle, deliberate, cold as marble. Her first thought was Thomas, her second was madness, her third was that she should probably stop thinking before she ended up in the same asylum they'd sent the last maid to after she claimed to see faces in the linens. Agnes had laughed at the story then. Now she wasn't sure it was funny. That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the rafters sounded like dripping cloth. She thought of her mother, of the kettle that killed her, and wondered whether all women in her family were destined to die surrounded by steam. She pressed her burned arm against the pillow and whispered to the darkness, "You'll not have me yet." The silence that followed felt almost amused. The next morning, when she stepped into the wash-house, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not lye, not soap, lavender, sweet and strong, as if someone had emptied a bottle of oil into the air. And there, on the centre table, was a single white sheet, folded so perfectly it could have passed inspection upstairs. On top of it sat one small green gooseberry. Agnes stood staring at the gooseberry for a long time, the steam from the vats curling around her ankles like lazy ghosts. She didn't touch it at first. There was something too deliberate about it, as though the house had decided to play at kindness, which was always more frightening than cruelty. Finally, she reached out and picked it up. It was cold, colder than fruit had any right to be, as if it had been resting in a grave instead of a garden. She turned it over in her fingers, half expecting a note to be tucked beneath it, something witty and ghostly like, "Don't forget to rinse twice." But there was nothing, just the silence of the laundry house, broken only by the occasional drip from the roof beam and the faint bubbling of a vat that refused to die down. She popped the gooseberry into her mouth anyway. It was sour enough to make her eyes water. "You always did have bad taste, Thomas," she muttered, and went back to work. The girls arrived soon after, chattering about supper, gossiping about who'd been caught pinching bread from the kitchen. Agnes said nothing of the fruit or the folded sheet. She'd learned early that in houses like Fairwick, the less you said, the less the house seemed to know about you. Sometimes she wondered if the walls themselves listened. They were so old, so thick with the breath of generations, that surely some part of them remembered. By autumn she'd developed the faint habit of talking to herself as she worked, though she called it thinking out loud, just to keep her pride intact. She'd murmur about her mother, about the price of soap, about the way her hair always smelled of smoke, no matter how much she scrubbed it. Once, when a bolt of wind blew the door open and sent her drying lines flapping wildly, she snapped, "Oh, stop your whining, I'm working as fast as I can." The lines went still, too still. She froze, her breath caught somewhere between laughter and fear. "Fine," she said at last, wringing out a shirt, "but if you want better service, you can fetch your own water." The uneasy truce between her and whatever shared the wash-house with her continued that way for weeks. Nothing overt, nothing she could name, just small things. A basin moved slightly from where she'd left it. A peg missing from the line. The faint scent of lavender blooming at odd hours, especially near the vats where the water ran darkest. She stopped mentioning Thomas's name out loud. The one time she did, the firewood cracked so loud she nearly dropped her paddle. At night, she began dreaming of him. Not as he was, but as he might have been if he'd never left. In the dreams, they were hanging sheets together, laughing, sunlight caught in the white folds. But when she turned to face him, his skin was pale as linen, and his mouth never quite opened when he smiled. She woke each time with the taste of metal on her tongue. She told herself it was from the lye fumes. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of washing the household's delicates, a word that had never seemed so ironic, she found herself lingering in the courtyard after the others left. The sun had already sunk, but a streak of red still burned low on the horizon, staining the drying sheets with colour like blood through gauze. She stood there, arms crossed, too tired to move. Then, faintly, she heard humming. It was coming from the laundry house, low, steady, and unmistakably human. She froze. No one should have been inside. The fires were out, the tubs cooling. The sound wove through the air, a tune she half recognized, her mother's lullaby, the one about the restless wind that never slept. She took a hesitant step forward. The door creaked open. The smell of lavender poured out so thick she nearly choked on it. Inside, the room glowed faintly, as if the air itself were lit from within. On the centre table lay a single sheet, smooth, spotless, and spread wide as though waiting to be folded. The humming stopped. Agnes didn't move. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat loud enough to drown her thoughts. Then, from somewhere behind her, just over her left shoulder, came a whisper, a voice soft as steam. "Still washing, Aggie?" She turned. No one there, only the half-light and the faint sway of linen in the window draught. Her knees went weak, but she laughed, short, sharp, defiant. "Aye," she said aloud, her voice trembling, "and I'll be washing long after your dust, whoever you are." The laugh that answered her wasn't hers. Agnes woke before dawn, as always, her eyes opening to darkness thick as soot. Her small cot creaked when she shifted, and the wool blanket scratched at her neck. The air was cold enough that her breath misted. She swung her legs over the side, found the floor with her bare feet, and sat for a moment with her head in her hands, letting her pulse catch up to her body. The smell of soap never quite left her skin, even in sleep. It clung to her like regret. She kept a tin cup and a basin by the window and poured in a few inches of water left from the night before. It was frigid, and she gasped as it touched her face. "Alive, then," she muttered. She washed quickly, hands, arms, neck, wiping with the same rag she used for everything. Clean wasn't the goal, survival was. When she had time, once or twice a week, she'd take a proper bath in the scullery tubs after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting in the lukewarm water until her fingers wrinkled like boiled linen. She called it her luxury. Breakfast was a wedge of bread and weak tea, eaten standing by the wash-house door. The bread was yesterday's, the tea as grey as the sky. Sometimes she'd smear a bit of dripping on it if the cook had been generous, but most days she simply chewed and swallowed, her jaw working like machinery. There wasn't time to linger. The day waited, and the day was always long. By 6, the vats were boiling. She stirred them methodically, the paddle heavy in her blistered hands. Steam rose in thick columns, turning her hair damp within minutes. The smell of lye filled her nose until she couldn't taste anything else. The other girls trickled in, bleary and muttering, and the day began in earnest, hauling, scrubbing, wringing, pegging. Hours passed without notice, marked only by the changing tone of the furnace fire and the occasional bark of Mr. Catterley's orders. When the midday bell rang, they had 20 minutes. Agnes sat on the low stone wall by the yard, chewing a crust of bread and a sliver of cheese that had seen better seasons. She didn't speak much. She preferred to listen. The girls gossiped about the upstairs footman, about who was courting whom, about the housekeeper's rumoured glass eye. Agnes smiled faintly when someone asked her if she ever planned to marry. "I'm already wedded," she said, nodding toward the steaming tubs, "to the boiling vat. We quarrel often, but the fire keeps us together." The girls laughed, but she didn't. By evening, her body ached in familiar places, shoulders, wrists, lower back. She stripped off her damp dress and changed into her plain nightgown, the fabric rough but dry. Before sleeping, she always visited the privy behind the laundry house. The path was muddy, lined with tall grass that brushed her ankles. The smell was dreadful, but she preferred the solitude. Under the moonlight, she could almost imagine she was anywhere else. By a river, maybe, or back in the village before her mother's accident. She'd sit there a moment longer than needed, breathing in the cold air to wash the day's smells from her lungs. Afterward, she returned to her quarters and rubbed her sore arms with a dab of goose fat she'd bartered from the cook. "For your burns," the woman had said, "and your troubles." It worked for neither, but Agnes appreciated the thought. She blew out her candle and lay down, eyes open to the dark. The sounds of the manor drifted through the night, clattering in the kitchen, a horse stamping in the stable, distant laughter from the servants' hall. Her body was too tired for dreams most nights. But sometimes, between waking and sleep, her mind began to hum with all she'd seen that day. The shifting sheets, the smell of lavender, the soft hiss of boiling water. She told herself these things weren't real. They were simply what happened when a person worked too hard, breathed too much steam, and slept too little. "It's just the heat talking," she whispered into the darkness. "That's all." But she'd wake an hour later, sweating despite the cold, heart thudding, the faint scent of lavender in the air again. Not strong, just enough to make her wonder whether her mind had gone soft or whether the house simply liked to remind her who it belonged to. Morning came again, and with it the same rhythm: water, soap, fire, steam. Between tasks, she nibbled at a crust of bread, took sips from her tin cup, occasionally splashed her face in the basin. She wasn't haunted, not exactly, just watched by her own thoughts, her own exhaustion. The line between rest and ruin was thin, and she walked it barefoot every day. Once, one of the maids asked her why she never seemed frightened, working alone so much in the dark corners of the manor. Agnes smiled. "Oh, I'm terrified," she said. "But there's nothing in this house half as dangerous as a boiling vat." The girl laughed nervously. Agnes didn't. She returned to stirring, and the steam rose around her like fog over a graveyard, thick, silent, and entirely human. By the time Agnes turned 21, the world had narrowed to the size of the laundry yard. She'd once dreamed of seeing a city, or even a fair, ribbons, crowds, oranges from far-off ports. But her days had a gravity that pulled her back each morning to the same four walls, the same hiss of steam, the same aching wrists. She told herself she didn't mind. Dreams, she reasoned, were for people with spare time. The rest of them had duties. She worked like a clock wound too tight. Wake, wash, eat, toil, bathe, sleep, repeat. Yet even in that loop, she found a rhythm of survival, a fragile, private grace that kept her from splintering. Each morning before lighting the fire, she'd lean on the window frame for a few stolen minutes and watch the grey dawn spill across the fields. The crows rose first, black against the pale sky, and she liked to imagine they were servants too, tireless, clever, and underappreciated. "Morning, gentlemen," she'd whisper. "You're the only ones who understand hours like these." Breakfast came when it came, usually dry bread and a corner of salted pork if she was lucky. She'd eat slowly, more to delay work than out of hunger. Then the day would claim her again, hauling water, tending fire, stirring the vats until her arms trembled. She'd hum sometimes to keep her breath steady, old songs from her mother's cottage, though they came out more like sighs. There were better days too, days when the sun warmed the yard and the linens fluttered clean and white, and she felt for a few fleeting minutes proud of the sight. Those were the days she'd chat with the other girls, sharing crumbs of humour like rationed sugar. "Do you ever wonder," one of them once asked, "if any of these fine ladies ever wash their own things?" Agnes smirked. If they did, they'd call for a priest the moment the lye touched their skin. The girls laughed, and for a moment the air seemed lighter. Then the bell rang, and back they went, into the steam, into the rhythm that wore them all thin. After supper, Agnes took her turn at the wash basin in her room. She'd splash her face and arms, rubbing away the grey film of work. When she could spare a bucket of warm water, she'd soak her feet and sigh in relief as if it were a holiday. On rare nights, she'd steal a piece of lavender soap from the upper rooms, one of the small perfumed cakes meant for guests, and scrub until her skin smelled faintly sweet. It felt like a rebellion. "If I must boil your linens," she whispered once, "I might as well smell better than you." Before bed, she'd visit the privy again, holding a small candle stub to light her way. The air was sharp and quiet. Sometimes she'd pause outside, the wind moving through her nightgown, and let herself breathe. That was her prayer, not words, just breathing, in, out, alive. Back in her room, she'd eat a bit of cold bread left from supper, drink a cup of water, then stretch out on the cot. Her hair was always damp, her hands always sore. She rubbed the small jar of goose fat between her palms before sleep. The scent had turned slightly rancid, but it helped the burns, and she pretended it was perfume. She fell asleep quickly most nights, not because she was peaceful, but because her body had no strength left for worry. Her dreams were plain, laundry lines swaying in wind, the sound of dripping water, the endless folding of sheets that never dried. Sometimes she'd see her mother's hands in the dream, wringing cloth beside hers, and she'd wake with tears already drying on her cheeks. Winter came again, and the frost bit through the cracks in the wash-house walls. The water buckets froze, the steam turned to fog so thick she could barely see her own hands. Her skin split at the knuckles, blood blooming red into the water like ink. She barely flinched anymore. "A little colour never hurt a white sheet," she'd mutter, pressing her thumb to the wound to stop the bleeding. The manor celebrated Christmas upstairs that year. Music drifted faintly down the hall, muffled laughter, the clinking of glass. Down below, Agnes and the others washed table linen stained with wine and gravy, their fingers numb, their backs bent. Someone started humming a carol, and Agnes joined in, her voice cracked but steady. For a moment, the song almost felt like warmth. When she finally crawled into bed that night, her body throbbed with a dull ache. She pulled the blanket over her head and whispered to herself, "Only a few more years, then I'll save enough to leave." She didn't believe it, not really, but she liked the sound of hope when it left her lips. Sleep came slowly. The fire in her bones didn't fade easily, but she smiled faintly in the dark, not from joy, but from sheer stubbornness. "Still here," she murmured, "still bloody here." The steam, the fire, the endless boiling, they hadn't broken her yet, and in a place like Fairwick, that was victory enough to count. By 23, Agnes had learned that survival wasn't about strength, it was about rhythm. Her body had adjusted to the heat, her mind to the monotony, her soul to the silence. She moved through her days like someone who'd made peace with being invisible. But if anyone mistook her quiet for meekness, they hadn't heard her mutter under her breath when a tub overflowed or a superior scolded her for a stain left by a lord's spilled claret. She'd curse softly, her words hidden beneath the hiss of steam. If these linens saw half the filth their owners hide, she'd whisper, they'd refuse to be white again. Every morning began the same. She woke before dawn, the cold biting through her thin blanket. She'd wash her face and arms at the basin, teeth chattering, the water shockingly alive against her skin. Then she'd twist her hair into a knot, pull on her coarse dress, and lace her boots, cracked but serviceable. Before stepping out, she'd sip from her tin cup, just water, but she always raised it slightly, a silent toast to herself. "Still here, Blackwell." Her meals were small but predictable. Bread, sometimes a bit of salt pork or cheese, and tea strong enough to dissolve a spoon. When she could, she saved crumbs for the birds that perched on the laundry yard wall. "You've got better wings than I ever will," she'd tell them, tossing pieces of crust. They never answered, but she liked their company all the same. Work consumed the rest of the day. She boiled, scrubbed, wrung, hung, folded. Sometimes she'd lose herself in the repetition, her hands moving while her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to places she'd never see. She imagined the sea, though she'd never been near it. She pictured it as one great boiling vat, the sky above it one endless drying line. "Wouldn't that be a sight?" she once said aloud, laughing quietly. "The Lord himself pegging out clouds." The other maids laughed when she joked, though not always kindly. They said she had a strange way of thinking, half sense, half madness. Agnes didn't mind. "Madness," she told them, "is just what you call someone who keeps talking after the rest of you give up." When the day ended, she scrubbed her hands clean as best she could. The skin had grown rough, the nails broken. Some nights she soaked them in the basin with warm water and a bit of vinegar, a trick she'd learned from her mother. She called it pretending to be a lady. Before bed she'd eat again, something small, maybe leftover broth or a heel of bread dipped in it. Then she'd walk to the privy, candle in hand, her breath visible in the night air. It was quiet there, and she liked to linger a bit, listening to the soft murmur of the wind through the hedges. Sometimes she'd hum, a tune so faint even she could barely hear it. When she returned to her cot, she always washed her feet and rubbed her ankles with a scrap of cloth before slipping under the blanket. She told herself that as long as she did that, washed her face, her feet, her hands, she was still human, not just a pair of arms for boiling and scrubbing. Sleep came easily most nights, though it wasn't restful. Her dreams were full of water, always water, rushing, hissing, dripping, endless. Once she dreamed of walking through the courtyard in her nightgown, the sheets towering above her like walls. In the dream, she wasn't afraid. She just kept walking, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth, until everything around her turned white. When she woke, her pillow was damp from sweat, her hair stuck to her temples. "Steam in the head," she muttered, turning over. On Sundays, her half-day off, she washed herself properly in the scullery. She'd fill a copper basin, mix hot and cold water until it was just right, and sink into it with a sigh that came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. She scrubbed from head to toe, rinsed her hair, and then just sat there for a few minutes, quiet, eyes closed, the warmth wrapping her like mercy. Afterward, she'd dress in her cleanest frock, eat a small bowl of porridge, and sit outside under the elm tree near the courtyard, where the wind smelled of soap and grass. She liked to feel the sun on her arms. Proof I still exist, she'd tell herself. The other girls sometimes went into the village on their half-day to flirt or buy ribbons. Agnes stayed behind. She didn't trust freedom. It always came with a price. Instead, she wrote. Not much, just scraps of thoughts, on old paper salvaged from laundry tags. Bits of sentences, jokes, the odd bit of truth she wasn't sure belonged anywhere else. She kept them in a tin box under her bed, her secret, her voice in a house that never asked for it. She was young still, 23, but her face had taken on that look the servants all shared, alert eyes in a tired face, as if always listening for the next command. Yet something in her had hardened into quiet defiance. She wasn't angry anymore, just unyielding. One evening, when the housekeeper scolded her for returning linens less white than the Lord intended, Agnes bowed slightly and said, "Forgive me, ma'am. I'll ask the Lord what soap he prefers." The laughter that followed from the other maids got her a full day's extra work, but she didn't mind. Work at least made sense. It was the only part of life that answered when spoken to. By 25, Agnes had long since stopped believing that life offered surprises. So when a man named Samuel Hurst began stopping by the laundry yard to deliver firewood, she barely looked up at first. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with hands like hewn oak, and a habit of whistling through his teeth when nervous. The first time he spoke to her, he said, "You work harder than the furnace does." She snorted. "The furnace gets fed more often." He laughed, the kind of laugh that sounded unused. They spoke now and then after that, about weather, wood, and wages, nothing fancy. He'd leave her small things, an apple once, a bit of string, once even a pair of wool gloves, clumsy but warm. The other girls teased her mercilessly, calling him the firewood suitor. Agnes rolled her eyes. "If he's after me, he'll regret it soon enough. I eat like a bird and curse like a drunk." But she smiled when she said it. They married in the spring of 1865 in a stone chapel 2 miles from Fairwick. It was a modest affair, no lace, no music, just Samuel, Agnes and the vicar, who seemed relieved it was over quickly. She wore her best grey dress, mended twice, and carried a sprig of lavender because she couldn't afford flowers. Samuel kissed her cheek awkwardly afterward and said, "Well then, we'll make do." And she thought, that's as fine a vow as any. Their cottage was small, a single-story dwelling with a low roof and a crooked chimney that smoked whenever it rained. It sat near a patch of elder trees, their blossoms perfuming the air each summer. Inside there was barely space for a table, a bed, and a wooden cradle Samuel had carved before the wedding, though they had no child yet. Agnes kept the place tidy but simple. She'd scrub the floorboards on her knees every Sunday morning, muttering, "At least this floor knows who walks on it." Her days changed, but didn't lighten. She still worked at the manor, walking the mile each dawn, her boots wet with dew. At night she returned home, body aching, hands raw. But now, when she stepped through the door, there was Samuel waiting, quiet, steady, sometimes asleep in the chair with his boots still on. He wasn't much for words, but his presence filled the room like warmth from a slow fire. The next year she bore their first child, a daughter they named Clara. The birth nearly broke her, long, feverish, with the village midwife whispering prayers that didn't sound convincing. But when Clara cried for the first time, Agnes laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "You've got lungs enough to work the wash-house yourself," she whispered. The weeks after the birth blurred together, sleepless nights, endless feedings, the ache of recovery. Samuel helped as best he could, but he worked long days carting timber for the manor. Agnes was granted a short leave, though not paid, and when her strength returned, she had no choice but to go back to work. That's when Mrs. Rowley entered her life. Mrs. Rowley was an elderly widow who lived 2 cottages over, a woman built like a flour sack and smelling faintly of mint and chimney smoke. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but her hands were gentle, and her laugh could scare away any gloom. She offered to watch Clara while Agnes worked. "Don't you fret," she said, patting Agnes's arm. "I've raised 6 of my own and buried 4. I know how to keep one breathing." It was the kind of honesty Agnes trusted. Each morning, Agnes bundled Clara in a shawl and carried her across the lane to Mrs. Rowley's hearth. The old woman would take the baby, coo softly, and tuck her near the fire. "You just do your work, dear," she'd say. "I'll see she grows fat and loud." And she did. Clara thrived, rosy-cheeked, always kicking her feet like she meant to run before she could crawl. Agnes would return each evening, half dead from exhaustion, and find her daughter sleeping peacefully in the cradle by the fire. Mrs. Rowley would hand her a cup of warm milk and mutter, "She's been an angel today." Screamed only half the afternoon. Agnes would smile weakly, kiss her child's forehead and whisper, "Good girl, keep the racket for tomorrow." At night, when Samuel came home, they ate together. Bread, broth, sometimes potatoes if they'd been lucky at the market. They spoke little, both too weary for chatter. But once, after Clara had fallen asleep, Samuel brushed a strand of hair from Agnes's face and said, "You've not laughed much lately." She looked up from her bowl, smirked and said, "I used to boil ghosts all day. Now I just wash socks. It's an improvement." He laughed quietly, kissed her forehead, and the moment passed like a soft flame. The seasons turned. Clara learned to walk, then talk, her small voice bright in the dim cottage. Mrs. Rowley became like kin. She mended Agnes's torn aprons, shared soup on cold nights, and taught her which herbs soothed a fever. "Put a bit of honey in the baby's milk," she'd say, "and she'll sleep like a bishop after confession." It worked. Most of the time. Life didn't get easier, but it felt fuller. Agnes still rose before dawn, still boiled, scrubbed, and wrung until her bones ached. But now there was a tiny pair of hands waiting for her at home, reaching up, sticky and smiling. Some evenings, when the workday had been cruel, she'd hold Clara close and whisper, "You'll not end up with lye on your hands, my girl. You'll have a better life if I have to wash the world clean myself." And Mrs. Rowley, from her chair by the fire, would chuckle softly and say, "You'll see, dear. Children have a way of teaching the world to be kinder, or at least to mind its manners around their mothers." By 27, Agnes had mastered the impossible balance between motherhood and servitude. Each morning began in darkness, the cold air biting through the cracks of the cottage. She'd wake before anyone else, slip from bed so as not to wake Clara, and crouch by the hearth to coax the embers back to life. The fire never wanted to start on damp mornings. She'd blow gently, whispering curses and prayers in equal measure, until the first orange glow caught. The smell of smoke filled the cottage, familiar, almost comforting. Then came her little ritual, a quick wash in the basin, just enough to feel awake, a bite of bread if there was any, and a swallow of tea black as soot. Samuel would rise soon after, grunting softly, pulling on his work boots with the patience of a man who'd done the same thing for 20 years. He'd kiss her forehead before leaving, his beard rough against her skin. "You're up too early," he'd say. She'd smile faintly. "So's the laundry." Before she left for the manor, she'd bundle Clara in her shawl and carry her across the lane to Mrs. Rowley's cottage. The old woman would already be awake, kettle whistling, her grey hair tied in a bun that defied gravity. "Morning, my dear," she'd greet. "The world's turning again, I see." Agnes would hand her the baby, kiss Clara's cheek and murmur, "Be good for Granny Rowley." "Ha," Mrs. Rowley would reply, "good babies are boring. We'll keep her lively." The walk to the manor took 15 minutes, longer when the frost was heavy. She liked that time alone. No vats, no orders, no noise but her own footsteps. The fields stretched pale under the dawn, and sometimes a hare darted across her path. She took it as a good sign when it did. "Run while you can," she'd whisper. At the wash-house the day began as always. Water, soap, fire, steam. Her hands had toughened into something unrecognizable from the girl she'd been, yet her movements were steady, almost graceful now. She worked with quiet precision, no wasted motion, no chatter. The other maids teased her still for being too serious. "She folds like she's in church," one said. Agnes just smiled. "A good fold's holier than most prayers," she replied, and went on ringing. She ate lunch sitting on the same stone wall she had since she was 17. Bread, cheese, sometimes a boiled egg if she'd thought ahead. She'd close her eyes, tilt her head toward the weak sun, and pretend it was leisure. Then back to work. Evenings were her reward. She'd collect Clara from Mrs. Rowley's, who'd always have a story waiting, usually one involving Clara's latest mischief. Your little ones learned to climb chairs, she'd say. Gave me near apoplexy, she did. Agnes would laugh, weary but genuine. She gets that from her father's side. I've never been that ambitious. At home, supper was simple but warm, bread soaked in broth, a few slices of turnip, occasionally salt pork. Samuel would sit beside her, Clara on his knee, the fire painting the room in amber light. Those were the moments Agnes cherished most. No shouting overseer, no hissing vats, just the crackle of wood and the quiet sound of her family breathing. Sometimes she'd rest her head on Samuel's shoulder and drift half asleep while he hummed tunelessly. After putting Clara to bed, Agnes took a small basin to the back of the cottage for her nightly wash. She'd roll up her sleeves and splash the cool water over her arms and face, shivering at first, then sighing. She washed her feet carefully too, rubbing them dry with a scrap of old linen. Clean hands, clean feet, clean conscience, she'd mutter, her mother's saying. Then she'd step into bed beside Samuel, muscles aching but heart steady. Sleep came quickly, the years crept quietly like that. Work, home, child, sleep, until the pattern itself felt sacred. Mrs. Rowley became as dear as family. She taught Agnes small things that made life gentler, how to brew nettle tea for strength, how to rub soot and lard on chilblains, how to keep mice away with dried mint. Old ways, she said, keep young women alive. Sometimes when Clara was asleep, Agnes stayed by the old woman's hearth just to talk. They'd speak of the village, of husbands, of the odd miracle of babies learning to smile. You've done well, dear, Mrs. Rowley would say, sipping her tea. You've built yourself a little world. Agnes would nod slowly, staring into the fire. A small one, she'd say. The old woman would chuckle. Small worlds are the only ones you can keep tidy. One evening, after walking home from work in the rain, Agnes found Clara awake, sitting up in her cradle, giggling. Her hair was a wild halo, her cheeks flushed. Agnes lifted her, kissed her damp forehead and said softly, "You're worth every blister, you know that?" The child just yawned and pressed her tiny hand against Agnes's neck. It was warm there, that small palm. Warm and real. And in that moment, as the rain drummed on the roof and the fire crackled low, Agnes thought maybe life hadn't cheated her after all. It hadn't given her ease or riches or rest, but it had given her this, a home, a child, and a stubborn, unkillable will. For a woman like her, that was close enough to grace. By 30, Agnes had lines around her mouth that deepened when she smiled, and she smiled often enough to keep them permanent. Her days were still shaped by the rhythm of water and work, but now there was Clara waiting at the end of them, a small and growing miracle who talked more than she slept and had inherited her mother's unblinking stare. The girl was 4 now, sturdy and sharp. She followed Agnes from one end of the cottage to the other, asking questions that came like a river. Why does soap bite your hands? Why does fire eat wood? Why don't we live upstairs like the fine people? Agnes answered each with the dry humour that kept her from crumbling. Because the soap's a jealous thing, she'd say. Because fire's greedy. And because upstairs folk haven't yet learned to be happy with what's theirs. Mrs. Rowley, who had once been round and bustling, was thinner now. Her hands trembled when she held her teacup, and her walk had slowed to the pace of memory. Still, she insisted on minding Clara while Agnes worked. "I can't sit idle," she'd declare. "If I'm to die soon, I'll die busy." Agnes always rolled her eyes. "You've been dying for 3 years, Mrs. Rowley. You're worse at it than any woman I know." The old woman would laugh until she coughed, then wave her off with her kerchief. "That's because I've out-argued death too many times." Each morning, the routine stayed the same. Agnes washed quickly, tied her hair back, and prepared a small bowl of porridge for Clara before walking her to Mrs. Rowley's. The old woman would greet them at the door in her worn shawl, eyes bright despite her frailty. "Off to boil the world again, are you?" "Aye," Agnes would say, adjusting Clara's shawl, "and it still won't come clean." Then she'd kiss her daughter's cheek, breathe in the scent of milk and wood smoke, and start the long walk to the manor. The work had changed little over the years, though her endurance had. Her arms were corded with muscle now, her back straight but stiff. The overseers had stopped barking at her long ago. Agnes Blackwell didn't need telling. She moved through her labour with quiet command, her presence enough to keep the younger girls in line. When a new girl complained about the heat or the burns, Agnes would nod toward the vats and say, "They don't care for sympathy. Keep your hands moving and the day will end quicker." She still ate lunch on the same stone wall. The others often joined her, gossiping about sweethearts and wages. Agnes mostly listened, chewing her bread and cheese, her thoughts elsewhere. Sometimes she'd watch the sky instead, wondering if Clara was napping yet, if Mrs. Rowley had remembered to give her milk warm and not scalding. She'd smile faintly at the thought. Evenings were her sanctuary. She'd return home to find Clara sitting on Mrs. Rowley's knee, chattering about her day. "Your daughter nearly drowned my cat in the washtub," the old woman would say. "Claims she was teaching him to swim." "Good," Agnes would reply. "He's been lazy." After supper, she and Samuel would sit by the fire, Clara curled against them. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. It was enough just to exist in the same small warmth after a day that had stolen so much from them. Agnes liked to brush Clara's hair before bed, counting softly with each stroke, 1, 2, 3, until the child's eyes drooped. When the girl finally slept, Agnes would sit watching her for a while, her heart aching with both pride and fear. She wanted her daughter to grow strong but not hard, clever but not bitter. She wanted her to laugh often enough to make the wrinkles worth it. Mrs. Rowley's decline was slow but certain. Her joints swelled, her breath grew shallow, and she spent more hours in her chair by the hearth. Yet she still kept Clara each day, insisting the child gave her life meaning. "She's the last young thing I'll ever teach," she'd say. "After her, I'll rest easy." Agnes would bring her small gifts in gratitude, an extra loaf, a jar of broth, a bit of cloth from the manor's scraps. The old woman always scolded her for it. "I've enough. Save your pennies for the girl." One winter night, when the wind howled down the chimney and the snow thickened on the sill, Agnes found herself sitting beside Mrs. Rowley long after Clara had gone to bed. The old woman's eyes were half closed, her hands folded in her lap. "You've done well, my dear," she murmured. "You've made a good life out of hard clay." Agnes stared into the fire. "It's not much of a life." Mrs. Rowley smiled faintly. "It's honest. That's rarer than happiness." When Agnes finally rose to leave, the old woman called after her, "When I go, promise you'll tell the girl about me. Make me sound kinder than I was." Agnes turned at the door, her expression soft. "You were plenty kind, Mrs. Rowley. Just not to fools." "Then tell her I was terrible," the old woman said, chuckling. "Children love villains best." She died 3 weeks later, in her sleep, with the fire still burning beside her. Agnes found her that morning, the room cold but peaceful. She wept quietly, not like a woman undone, but like one wringing out the last of what her heart could hold. After the funeral, Clara asked where Mrs. Rowley had gone. Agnes brushed a curl from her daughter's face and said simply, "She's resting now. She worked harder than anyone should have to." The child nodded solemnly. "Like you?" Agnes smiled, weary and proud. "A bit like me, but I'm not resting yet." That evening, when Clara fell asleep beside her, Agnes sat awake by the hearth, mending a torn sleeve under the flicker of the flame. Outside, the wind was sharp and alive, and the smell of soap still clung to her skin. Her hands were older, her back tired, but her spirit, stubborn thing that it was, kept burning quietly on. In the soft light, she whispered to herself, "Still here." Then she smiled at the cradle's shadow on the wall and added, "And so is she." By the time Agnes Hurst reached her middle 30s, she was the sort of woman who could fold a sheet so sharp you could cut your conscience on it. The girls in the wash-house whispered that she'd been there since the manor was built, that she could tell the water's temperature by the sound it made when it boiled. She never corrected them. A little myth was useful. It kept them from asking her to fetch extra firewood. Her body had grown into the rhythm of the work. She could lift a bucket with one hand, stir a vat with the other, and scold 2 girls simultaneously for letting soap scum settle on the linens. The younger ones called her Mrs. Hurst, with a tone that mixed fear and admiration. She had the calmness of someone who'd already survived everything once. Her mornings began before dawn, when the air was still black and sharp enough to bite. She'd roll out of bed quietly so as not to wake Samuel or little Clara, crouch by the hearth and coax the embers back to life with her breath. When the first spark caught, she'd murmur, "See? Even fire knows better than to argue with me." Then she'd pour a splash of water into the basin and wash her face, wincing at the cold that made her skin sting awake. Her breakfast was always the same: stale bread softened in tea and a corner of cheese if she'd remembered to save it from the day before. Before leaving, she'd peek into Clara's room. The child slept in a tangle of blankets, one arm hanging over the side of the bed. Agnes always paused there a moment, brushing a bit of hair from the girl's forehead. "Sleep, my love," she'd whisper. "Dream of something that doesn't sweat." The road to Fairwick Manor was long and half frozen in winter, but Agnes liked the quiet walk. It was the only time of day that belonged to her. The fields were pale and empty, the horizon bruised with dawn. Sometimes she'd see the milk cart ahead or a servant trudging in the same direction, their breath smoking in the cold. Once in a while she'd talk to the crows perched on the fence posts. "Still alive then," she'd say. "Good for you. Try not to drop dead till supper." By the time she reached the laundry yard, the air had already thickened with steam and the smell of lye. The ATS hissed like living things, the fire glowed orange beneath the copper, and the whole room pulsed with the slow rhythm of hard labour. Agnes moved through it all like a conductor. "Not that much soap, Maggie, you'll peel the flesh off the sheets. Turn that cloth before it bites you, Alice. Lord, have you never seen water before?" The new girls watched her with a kind of reverence. She was fast, exact, and merciless. "Works like a husband," she told them once. "Ignore it, and it'll make your life miserable. Handle it right, and it'll still make your life miserable, just in a neater fashion." At midday, she'd step outside, sit on the low wall by the pump, and eat her bread with the deliberate slowness of someone refusing to be hurried. The younger women would chatter about sweethearts, fashion, or the kitchen footman's shoulders. Agnes would just raise an eyebrow. "A man's shoulder won't feed you," she'd say, "unless you plan to eat him." When the day ended, her arms would hum with the deep ache that lived in her bones now, not pain, just proof of existence. She'd walk home with her shawl pulled tight, the cold air slicing the heat of the day off her skin. The sun would already be sinking, painting the horizon in dull fire, and she always thought it looked a bit like the inside of the wash-house, only prettier and less judgmental. At home, she'd open the cottage door to warmth and sound, the clatter of Clara's chatter, the smell of stew thickening over the fire, Samuel humming tunelessly as he patched his coat. She loved that moment most, the change in air, the sense that everything she did out there had built this small, flickering peace in here. Supper was plain but filling: bread, stew, and the occasional luxury of pickled onion if the week's wages had stretched far enough. They ate together, sometimes talking, sometimes quiet. Clara always had stories from the day, what she'd learned from Mrs. Rowley before the old woman's passing, which children in the lane were playing marbles, what new word she'd spelled correctly. Agnes listened, smiling faintly, her fingers rubbing the edge of her bowl. "You talk better than I ever could," she'd say. "That'll be your way out of all this." Afterward, she washed at the basin, sleeves rolled, water sloshing cool over her skin. It wasn't a bath, but it was enough to feel human again. She'd scrub her arms, her face, and her feet, always her feet. "You can tell the difference between a servant and a corpse by whether her feet are clean," she joked once. Clara had giggled. "Do corpses have dirty feet?" "Only the respectable ones," Agnes replied. When Clara went to bed, Agnes would sit by the hearth mending clothes, the firelight soft on her face. Samuel sometimes read aloud from a newspaper he'd borrowed from the mill office, though neither of them believed half of what it printed. When he finished, she'd nod toward the headline and mutter, "If men worked half as hard as they talked, the world would have been fixed by now." Sunday was her half-day off, though the word off was used loosely. She still boiled water for washing, still mended, still cooked, but she also took an hour for herself, to sit outside under the elm tree behind the cottage and just breathe. Clara would sometimes sit beside her, plucking grass and asking impossible questions. "Mama," Why do rich people always look so clean? Agnes smirked. Because someone like me gets dirty for them. Will I have to? Not if I can help it, Agnes said, pulling her daughter close. You've got quicker hands than mine. Maybe yours will build something instead of scrub it. Her work at the manor went on year after year, but Agnes never let bitterness take her. She joked through burns, laughed through blisters, and faced every new overseer like an old friend she didn't particularly like. When one young steward complained that the linens smelled too plain, she said, "Next time I'll boil them in perfume, sir." Perhaps lavender and regret. He didn't ask again. Her strength didn't falter, though some evenings she leaned a little heavier on the doorframe when she got home. Clara had started helping with the smaller wash, earning a few pennies for herself. Agnes pretended to scold her for working, but secretly admired her determination. "You'll make a fine woman, my girl," she said, "one with sense enough to see through every fool who tells you you've got it easy." When she lay in bed at night, the day would replay in her bones, the slosh of water, the hum of the fire, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat echoing like a ringer's churn. She never called it exhaustion. She called it proof she was still alive. Sometimes, just before drifting to sleep, she'd think of her mother, that woman with the strong hands and the sad eyes who'd never lived to see her daughter survive this long. Agnes would smile faintly into the dark and murmur, "You'd laugh if you saw me now, Ma. I outlasted the kettles." Then she'd close her eyes, the smell of soap and smoke still clinging to her hair, and let the world go dim again, knowing that at dawn she'd rise and do it all over because that's what women like her did. They boiled, they scrubbed, they folded the world clean, one aching armful at a time. Fairwick Manor had a heartbeat, and Agnes Hurst knew its rhythm better than anyone living under its roof. It thudded through the walls at dawn when the scullery doors banged open, hummed in the pipes when the baths filled upstairs, and sighed in the long echoing corridors when the family took tea at 4. She had come to know that house like a second body, one that never slept and always leaked. Though she belonged to the wash-house by right of sweat and reputation, her duties sometimes took her inside the main mansion. She was the only laundress the housekeeper trusted to carry linens to the family's private rooms. That was a mark of status, apparently, being allowed to set foot where the carpets were thick enough to silence regret. Agnes hated it and loved it in equal measure. The upstairs world was like a stage play with terrible actors, all silk and sighing and the faint smell of powder and money. She'd step carefully down the long halls, basket on her hip, and listen to the hush that came with privilege. No clatter, no barking orders, just the faint tick of a clock worth more than her cottage. She delivered to Lady Fairwick first, whose dressing gowns weighed more than Agnes's sense of humour. The woman always received her linens as if they'd been fetched from heaven itself, pressing a perfumed handkerchief to her nose as though cleanliness were contagious. "Ah, Mrs. Hurst," she'd say faintly, so prompt as ever. "Yes, ma'am," Agnes would answer, keeping her face smooth as porcelain. "Soap waits for no one." Lady Fairwick never caught the joke, which made it better. Sometimes she'd glimpse the master of the house, Lord Fairwick, passing through the corridor, a tall man with the permanent look of someone bored by oxygen. He never spoke to her, only nodded absently, as though she were part of the furniture. Agnes didn't mind. Furniture was treated better than servants, most days. She learned over time to read their world through laundry. A blood stain on a cuff, a lipstick smudge on a collar, a faint scent of tobacco that didn't belong to the master's blend. The house spoke to her in fabric and fibre. She could tell when the family argued, when they entertained, when they were too sick to leave bed. Every wrinkle told a story, every sheet a confession. Once, she was sent upstairs to retrieve a batch of linen that hadn't been stripped by the maids. She knocked softly, then stepped into the ladies' chamber and froze. There, sitting at the vanity, Lady Fairwick was weeping, quiet, elegant weeping, the kind rich people practiced like a skill. Agnes stood awkwardly for a moment, basket in hand. The lady looked up, startled, then dabbed at her eyes. "I didn't hear you." "No, ma'am," Agnes said, voice steady. "You weren't listening." The lady blinked at her, unsure whether she'd been insulted. Agnes curtsied, gathered the linens, and left without another word. Back in the wash-house, the girls begged her for gossip. What's she crying for, Mrs. Hurst? Lost a diamond? Agnes smirked. Something smaller and more expensive, her pride. Working upstairs reminded her daily that the world's filth didn't come from dirt. It came from people with enough money to hide it. She once carried down a bedsheet with a stain so stubborn she thought it might file for tenancy. When one of the young maids asked what it was, Agnes said, "Sin, probably, but don't fret, it'll come out in the second boil." Despite her sharp tongue, she kept her job because no one ran a wash-house like her. The butler said she could bring the dead back white. The cook said she could boil manners into a mop. And even the housekeeper, stiff and God-fearing, admitted, "Mrs. Hurst's hands may be rough, but her work is blessed." Agnes didn't disagree. She knew that blessings were just curses you got paid for. Sometimes she lingered in the mansion's back corridors after delivering laundry, just to breathe in the strange stillness of wealth. It was too quiet for her liking, the kind of silence that didn't come from peace but from people pretending they were above noise. She missed the hiss of boiling water, the clank of buckets, the honest racket of labour. Upstairs, even misery was muffled. Once, while crossing the gallery with her basket, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the gilt-framed mirrors, her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled, her arms streaked with the faint red of lye burns. Behind her, the painted ladies of Fairwick past smiled from their portraits, perfect and idle. Agnes stared at her own face and thought, "You work harder than all their generations put together, and you'll still be the one forgotten first." Then she snorted softly. At least they don't have to boil their corsets. The housekeeper scolded her once for laughing under her breath in the family corridor. "Dignity, Mrs. Hurst," she'd said sternly. "One must remember where one stands." Agnes replied, "Oh, I remember, ma'am. I'm the one who keeps everyone else from slipping." After that, she was never scolded again. Each evening, she'd leave the manor when the sky was turning gold and the air carried that damp scent of soap, smoke, and finished work. Her hands would ache, but her shoulders felt alive, used, not broken. The girls walking with her would chatter endlessly, but Agnes just listened, half smiling. Let them dream, she thought. Every dream deserves a rinse before it's ruined. When she reached her cottage door, Clara would already be waiting in the yard, waving. "Mama!" the girl would cry, running barefoot through the grass. And in that instant, every burn, every ache, every sting of lie meant nothing. Agnes would scoop her up, breathe in the clean scent of her daughter's hair, and mutter, "You're the only thing in this world that never needs scrubbing." Inside, Samuel would be setting supper, and the fire would glow like a promise. Agnes would wash her hands in the basin, sighing as the day ran off her skin, and sit down with her family. No fancy linens, no candles, just the sound of spoons and the small warmth of a life honestly earned. And in her heart, she knew the truth she'd never say aloud, that the upstairs folk, for all their perfume and privilege, would never know what it meant to end a day tired and clean. The mansion had a rhythm that repeated itself with religious devotion. Morning began with bells, always bells. One for breakfast, one for dressing, one for whatever crisis had unfolded in silk sheets overnight. By the third bell, Agnes could already tell what kind of day it would be. If the ring came late, someone upstairs had overslept. If it came early, someone had sinned. She'd arrive at the laundry yard before the others, the air still grey with mist, and light the fires herself. The hiss of the first boil was her morning hymn. The flames licked the copper vats, and the steam climbed steadily until the room turned into a cloud. She liked it that way. The steam softened the edges of things. It made all classes of people look the same. The housemaids arrived in pairs, laughing too loud, smelling faintly of starch and gossip. Agnes let them chatter for a bit before setting them to work. "Wash first, talk later," she'd say. "Nothing good's ever come out of a clean mouth and dirty hands." By mid-morning, the delivery lists arrived from upstairs, long pages of linen and lace, written in perfect loops by a lady's hand that had never held a wringer. Agnes could read their moods through their handwriting. If the script was neat, the lady was content. If it leaned too far to the right, there'd been an argument. And if it came smudged with a faint ring of spilled wine, she'd prepare extra soap. She carried the clean loads back through the back stairs the route servants were permitted to use, a narrow tunnel of worn steps that smelled of polish and secrets. Sometimes she passed the cooks hauling platters or the footmen carrying trays, each of them moving with the quick, quiet grace of people trying to avoid being seen. They all nodded to her with respect. Everyone knew that Mrs. Hurst ran the lower quarters like a ship captain, firm, efficient, and unflappable. Once the butler told her, "You keep that laundry smoother than the mistress keeps her temper." Agnes smiled thinly. "That's because I can rinse out stains." She can't. She spent hours upstairs each week now, sorting, folding, delivering. She'd learned to navigate that upper world without looking out of place. She walked softly on the thick carpets and kept her gaze low enough to please, high enough to notice everything. If the master's study smelled sharply of tobacco and another kind of perfume, she said nothing. If the lady's lace returned with a tear shaped too precisely to be accidental, she said nothing. But she remembered everything. Servants trusted her silence. Housemaids told her things they shouldn't. "She's been crying again," they'd whisper about Lady Fairwick. "Sends the sheets down soaked, she does." Agnes would nod, eyes fixed on her work. "Best keep it to yourself," she'd advise. "Water always finds its own level. So does trouble." In the evenings, when the manor's lamps glowed and the upstairs halls filled with piano music, she sometimes lingered near the back door before heading home. She liked to listen, not to the notes themselves, but to the pauses between them. That's where the truth hid. No one who was happy ever played that slow. At home, life was simpler but not easier. Clara was 11 now, bright, restless, full of questions. She had begun asking about the manor, about the ladies, about what they wore and what they did. Agnes would answer just enough to satisfy her. "They dress like they're afraid of air," she'd say, "and they spend their days pretending not to be bored." Clara frowned once and said, "Do they ever smile?" "Not with their mouths," Agnes replied, "but they pay us to keep the rest of them spotless." Samuel, for his part, stayed steady, still hauling timber, still coming home with sawdust in his hair and quiet in his eyes. He'd listen to her stories in the evenings, shaking his head with that small, amused disbelief only working men had. "Seems a waste," he'd say, "all that money just to end up crying into clean sheets." Agnes smirked. "Better than crying into dirty ones, that's my business." Her humour kept her safe. Laughter was her armour, but underneath it was a fierce pride. She had become indispensable. When the housekeeper fell ill one week, it was Agnes who ran the whole washing staff. When the boiler cracked, she was the one who fixed it, sleeves rolled, muttering under her breath, "Men build the world too thin." Her back ached most nights, her hands raw from lye, but her spirit stayed iron. She'd learned to pace herself, to measure her strength like coin. When a young laundress complained one afternoon, "It never ends," Agnes replied, "That's the trick of it. It never does. You just learn to work before it kills you." There were small satisfactions, though. She liked watching the linens she'd boiled flutter in the courtyard wind, rows of white cloth catching the sunlight like banners. To her, it looked like proof that something in this world could come clean, even if it didn't stay that way long. She took quiet joy, in order, in small victories, a stubborn stain lifted, a batch finished ahead of time, a new girl finally learning not to blister herself. And when she walked home each night, the air cool against her face, she thought not of the family upstairs, but of the little life she'd built below. Her child, her home, the steady heartbeat of something that belonged only to her. Inside the manor, she was the unseen backbone. Outside it, she was a wife, a mother, and a woman whose laughter had become part of the village air. And still, every morning she returned, to the steam, to the hiss, to the endless folding. Because the world, Agnes knew, didn't wash itself. And until it did, she'd keep her hands in the water. By the time she'd spent 15 years at Fairwick, Agnes had learned that hierarchy was mostly laundry by another name. Everyone pretending their stains were smaller than someone else's. The housekeeper carried herself like a queen, the butler like a bishop, and the family like porcelain statues too delicate for human use. The only difference was that Agnes knew how to make all of them look presentable. She was trusted now, even deferred to, though no one would admit it aloud. When a task turned impossible, when the lye burned too hot or the starch went wrong, it was, "Fetch Mrs. Hurst." The housekeeper had once tried to scold her for her tone. "There's a way to speak in service, Mrs. Hurst," to which Agnes replied, "Yes, ma'am," clearly and loud enough to be heard over the boiling. The housekeeper didn't correct her again. Her days had become a kind of choreography, the same steps, the same music, but Agnes had learned to make it her own. Mornings began with the whistle of steam, that slow, almost living sound that filled the wash-house like breath. The girls rushed in, hair damp, eyes dull with fatigue, muttering complaints about the heat. Agnes never snapped. She just raised an eyebrow and said, "Better to sweat now than rot later." It wasn't motivation, exactly, but it worked. She'd inspect the first batch of linens with the gravity of a priest reading confessions. Her fingers moved fast, practiced, checking corners, tugging seams, folding with the kind of precision the gentry would call art if they'd ever bent over a washtub themselves. "You'll know you're doing it right," she told the younger ones, "when your knuckles look like they owe you money." Lunch was her favourite part of the day, not because of the food, but because it was the only time she could sit still without feeling like she'd stolen something. She'd perch on the low stone wall by the yard and eat her bread slowly, eyes half closed, pretending the heat on her face was sunlight, not steam. The girls gossiped around her, who fancied which footman who'd been caught sneaking sugar from the pantry, who had the nerve to dream of leaving. Agnes listened with one ear and half a smile. "If you want a life without sweat," she said once, "find a man rich enough to pay someone else to do it for you. Then spend the rest of your days pretending not to be bored." Her dry wit made her both loved and feared. The kitchen maids adored her for her cleverness, the butler avoided her for the same reason. Once, when he tried to lecture her about punctuality, she said, "I'd be earlier if the sun rose when I told it to. Should I send it a note through you?" He stared, open-mouthed, and she went back to folding as though she'd merely commented on the weather. She began to know the upstairs family the way only servants can, not through conversation but through evidence. Lady Fairwick's nightdresses came down faintly scented with brandy one week, rosewater the next. The master's shirts alternated between smelling of cigars and someone else's perfume, and the children's bedding came with the faint familiar marks of nightmares, tears, damp spots, the occasional trace of blood from bitten lips. Agnes never judged. She'd seen enough human mess to know that sin and soap had the same rule: you deal with them quickly, or they set in. There were whispers that Mrs. Hurst had the house's measure, that she knew more about the Fairwicks than their own kin. She did nothing to stop the rumour. Power was a rare thing for a woman like her, and knowledge was the only kind she could afford. She never used it cruelly, only wisely. Once, when a junior maid nearly lost her position after breaking a decanter in the drawing-room, Agnes quietly mentioned to the housekeeper that the lady's favourite nightgown had gone missing from her laundry basket the week before. The matter of the decanter was forgotten by morning. The maid never knew who'd saved her, but she looked at Agnes differently after that, half in gratitude, half in awe. Some evenings, Agnes worked late enough to glimpse the family's dinners being carried through the hall, silver platters gleaming, glasses chiming, voices lilting like songs sung in another world. She never envied them. She'd seen their dirty sheets. "They eat better," she once said to the cook, "but they sleep no cleaner." The cook laughed so hard she nearly dropped her ladle. Her humour was sharp enough to cut through the monotony, but it wasn't all armour. There were moments, rare ones, when the steam and clamour faded into something like quiet and she could hear her own thoughts again. In those moments, she thought about Clara. The girl was nearly grown now, quick-minded and restless, working part-time in the linen room upstairs. Agnes caught glimpses of her sometimes, head bent in concentration, face bright with purpose. It filled her with an ache she couldn't name, pride mixed with the faint fear that her daughter might outgrow the world Agnes had built for her. When they walked home together in the evenings, the girl would chatter about what she'd seen. The lady's new gown, the master's bad temper, the children's tantrums. Agnes listened with the patience of someone who'd learned that talk is often a luxury youth can afford. "They live high and cry hard," she'd tell Clara. "Remember that when you start thinking their grass looks greener. It's just watered with servants' tears." Back home, the small rituals steadied her, warming her hands over the fire, washing her arms in the basin, changing into a clean apron before supper. She'd help Clara with her lessons sometimes, tracing words with a finger roughened from soap and labour. "Write it plain," she'd say. "People will take you more seriously if they can read your insults." Sundays, her half-day, were the only times she allowed herself the smallest rebellion. She'd walk through the manor gardens, officially to collect laundry from the greenhouse staff, but really to breathe air that didn't smell of heat and human effort. The roses were always perfect, unnaturally so. The gardener pruned them as though nature itself needed supervision. Agnes would look at them and think, pretty, but they'd never survive the wash. The other servants joked that Mrs. Hurst could run the whole estate if she wanted to. "I already do," she'd mutter. "I just let them keep the titles." There were days the weight of it all pressed heavy on her. The endless water, the aching wrists, the knowledge that she'd scrubbed out more secrets than any confessor. But then she'd watch the clean linen snapping in the courtyard wind, bright and defiant against the sky, and she'd feel something close to pride. Not joy, not peace, those were luxuries, but pride, rough-edged and honest. Because Agnes Hurst might spend her life washing the sins of the Fairwicks, but she'd never let theirs stain her. And the next morning, when the bells began their shrill, familiar chorus, she was already awake, kettle on, sleeves rolled, ready to turn the world over and rinse it clean again. There was only one person in that whole house Agnes might have called a friend, though she'd never used the word aloud. Her name was Hetty Briggs, the undercook, a short woman with arms like mallets and a laugh that could curdle milk. They'd known each other for nearly a decade, trading gossip and sarcasm like rations of sugar. Hetty always smelled faintly of flour and smoke, and she cursed with more elegance than most ladies prayed. "I swear," she told Agnes once while scrubbing the bread oven, "if there's a heaven, it'll be empty." All the decent folk will be too tired to climb the stairs. Agnes had nearly dropped a sheet from laughing. The two of them had a standing ritual every Friday evening after work. Once the fires were banked and the last linen hung, they'd sit behind the wash-house, sharing a crust of bread and whatever leftovers Hetty had smuggled from the kitchen, usually cold pudding or a handful of roasted carrots. They didn't call it supper, they called it preventing starvation. Agnes always joked, "You risk your position for pudding," and Hetty would reply, "For better causes than pudding, but this one tastes the same." They talked about everything but themselves, the household's absurdities, the new housemaid's broken heart, the Fairwick children's endless ailments. "Them upstairs," Hetty said, chewing thoughtfully. "They break faster than plates." Agnes nodded. "Plates get washed, though." Sometimes, when the moon was bright and the courtyard quiet, Agnes let herself speak honestly. She talked about Clara, about the way the girl's handwriting had improved, about her dream of saving enough to send her to a proper school in the town. "She's clever," she'd say, half to herself. "Too clever to end up like me, with hands that think before the brain does." Hetty would grunt, wiping her hands on her apron. "Maybe so. But don't you go saying you turned out poorly. There's worse things than being unkillable." Agnes didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched. The cracks in the mansion began to show that same year, not in its walls but in its people. The Fairwicks' money had started to dry up, whispered first in the servants' hall, then trickling down through late wages and half-stocked pantries. One morning the housekeeper called a meeting, lips tight as a drawstring purse. "Economy," she said, as though it were a holy word. "We must all learn economy." Agnes raised an eyebrow. "Aye," she muttered. "The rich always learn it by teaching the poor." The kitchen fires burned lower now, the laundry received cheaper soap that burned the hands worse than lye. Agnes adapted as she always did, trimming where she could, coaxing brightness out of dullness. "We'll make do," she told the girls. "We always do. We're the elastic that keeps this house from snapping." Still, she saw the decay creeping in. The master grew thinner, his temper sharper. Lady Fairwick began ordering more lace than she could afford, as though beauty could distract from ruin. The eldest daughter, pale and quiet, spent more time pacing the garden, her face pinched with the misery of someone who'd never been taught what to do with her own hands. Agnes, ever the observer, said nothing but saw everything. She noticed when a new gentleman started visiting the house too often, when the ladies' nightgowns came down smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne. She noticed too when the lord's shirts began to arrive unwashed for days at a time, meaning he'd been sleeping elsewhere. Love and laundry, she muttered one morning, inspecting a stain shaped suspiciously like lipstick. Both of them leave marks that never quite come out. The staff talked in whispers. Some feared dismissal, others hoped for it. Hetty said she'd sooner marry a butcher than cook another half-portion meal for a family pretending to feast. Agnes just shrugged. At least the butcher's blood comes honest. Yet even as the grand life upstairs began to wobble, her own days remained steady, a small miracle of discipline and defiance. She still rose before dawn, washed her face in the basin till it stung, brushed her hair back, and tied her sleeves with the same precision as binding armour. The world could rot from the top down if it pleased. She'd keep her part of it clean. Clara had grown into a clever young woman by then, apprenticing as a seamstress in the town 2 days a week. She returned each evening with stories about customers who wanted gowns stitched tighter than their sense of decency. "They can't breathe," she said once, laughing, "but they call it fashion." Agnes smiled, stirring the stew. Ah, vanity, mankind's most expensive corset. Despite the tightening purse strings at Fairwick, Agnes remained indispensable. When they began cutting stuff, she was never on the list. "They can do without footmen before they can do without soap," she remarked dryly. She'd earned a reputation for solving problems others pretended not to notice. When a shipment of linens was delayed, she found an old stock in the attic. When a pipe burst, she patched it herself. When the ladies' petticoats came back ruined from the new starch, she rewashed and pressed them in silence. "Let the housekeeper think God did it," she told Hetty. "He could use the credit." Sometimes late at night she'd find herself alone in the laundry room long after the fires had gone out, listening to the faint echo of the house settling. It creaked and sighed like an old body trying to remember its posture. Agnes would sit on the low stool by the hearth, hands idle for once, and stare into the embers. She thought about what people like her left behind, not portraits, not legacies, but the invisible work that held the world together. Clean things, folded things, the quiet order that no one thanked you for until it was gone. Hetty once found her there like that, deep in thought, and said, "You look like a ghost waiting for your shift to end." Agnes blinked, then smirked. "If I'm a ghost, I'll haunt the laundry. Somebody's got to finish what's left." "You're mad. I've been called worse, mostly by linens." The Fairwick's decline carried on like slow rot in summer fruit, sweet on the outside, collapsing inside. Guests stopped coming. The piano upstairs fell silent. But downstairs, the laundry still steamed, the ovens still baked, and the servants still laughed quietly behind closed doors. Because people like Agnes knew the truth the family never would. That work was steadier than wealth, and laughter, especially the dark, exhausted kind, was the last luxury left standing. And when dawn came again, with its chill mist and the first whistle of boiling water, Agnes Hurst tied her apron tight and went back to it, sleeves rolled, mind sharp, eyes steady, determined to keep her corner of the world spotless, no matter how much the rest of it stained. She never planned to become important, which was probably why she did. By her late 30s, Agnes Hurst had become a quiet authority in a house that pretended not to notice her. The servants sought her counsel the way the desperate seek a priest, out of habit and with more hope than sense. They came to her for every sort of crisis: burns, heartbreak, stolen bread, missing wages. She had a cure for all of it. For a burn, cool water, not pity. For heartbreak, work harder. Sweat's the only thing that dries faster than tears. For stolen bread, eat it before you confess it. For missing wages, don't pray to the Lord, pray to the ledger. Even the housekeeper who once treated her like an errand with feet began to tread carefully. When the younger maids bickered, Agnes would settle them with a look, and when the butler forgot himself and barked orders too sharply, he'd find his shirts coming back a shade stiffer than usual. "A message from the starch," she'd say blandly. "It disapproves of your tone." The household's respect for her wasn't affection, it was survival. Agnes had seen too many of them come and go, breaking under work or marriage or foolishness. She lasted because she'd made peace with her place without ever surrendering to it. "Keep your head down," she told the girls, "but never so low you can't see what's coming." She understood that the mansion ran on illusions, money that was mostly credit, authority that was mostly bluff, morality that was mostly timing. The Fairwicks still held dinners they couldn't afford, still entertained guests who pretended not to see the chipped china, still spoke of improvements that never arrived. The servants called it the theatre upstairs. Agnes called it laundry of the soul. They keep washing their lives in denial, she said once to Hetty, and the water's been grey for years. Her own life outside those walls was small but solid. Clara had started courting a young carpenter from the village, polite and square-shouldered, a man who spoke to Agnes with the right mix of nerves and respect. "He works with wood," Agnes said to Hetty after meeting him. "That's a good sign. Wood doesn't argue back," Hetty snorted. "Neither does stone." "True," Agnes said, "but stone never keeps the rain out." She had little time to fret about romance. The household's disorder kept her occupied. The cook left without warning, the new laundress fainted twice her first week, and the lady of the house seemed perpetually on the verge of hysterics. Agnes patched each disaster the same way she patched torn sleeves, quietly, without ceremony. When the Fairwicks guests arrived one weekend to find the sheets crisp and the towels soft, the lady declared, "I don't know how you do it, Mrs. Hurst." Agnes smiled and said, "Neither do I, ma'am. It's mostly witchcraft and despair." The lady laughed, not realizing it wasn't a joke. Power, she discovered, rarely looked like power. It was being the one who knew how things worked when everyone else was pretending not to notice. It was understanding that the family needed her more than she needed them. When Lord Fairwick tried once to dismiss half the staff to cut expenses, Agnes simply raised an eyebrow and said, "I'll need 3 extra women for the clearing out then." He stared, confused. "Clearing what out?" "The laundry, my lord. You can't fire servants and keep clean shirts. It's one or the other." He walked away, muttering, and no one was dismissed. She'd become indispensable without ever meaning to, which is the only kind of indispensable that lasts. The housekeeper started asking her opinion off the record. The butler began addressing her as "Mrs. Hurst, if you please," and the lady trusted her with linens that no other hand was to touch. Agnes never let it go to her head. She just stored every bit of information like folded cloth, neatly in case it was needed later. Once, when the master was ill and the household in chaos, it was Agnes who organized the servants into shifts, sent for the doctor, and made sure the man's fever linen was changed before infection set in. The doctor praised her efficiency. "You've the makings of a nurse," he said. "No," she replied. "I've the makings of a woman who's cleaned up after fools too long." She laughed at her own boldness later, sitting behind the wash-house with Hetty, splitting a cold meat pie. "You'll end up running that place one day," Hetty said. "Heaven forbid," Agnes answered. "Then I'd have to start believing I'm important, and that's how people go mad." Still, she couldn't deny the strange satisfaction of it, the quiet knowledge that she could stop the mansion cold with one day of silence. If she didn't wash, they couldn't eat, sleep, or dress. The realization wasn't pride exactly, but it tasted close to it. When she walked the corridors now, even the air seemed to acknowledge her. Footmen stepped aside, housemaids lowered their voices. Lady Fairwick smiled nervously when their eyes met, as though aware that the woman holding her laundry also held her reputation. Sometimes Agnes wondered what her mother would think if she could see her now. Still in service, yes, but the kind of servant who could outlast a dynasty. Probably her mother would laugh that dry, practical laugh of theirs and say, "So you've learned the trick of it then, never climb higher than the person who can fall on you." Agnes would smile and whisper back, "Aye, Ma, I learned from the best." And then, when morning came again, she'd roll up her sleeves, light the fires, and start another day of boiling, folding, surviving, watching the grand Fairwick family live their delicate disasters, one freshly pressed sheet at a time. By the time Agnes Hurst reached her late 40s, she had stopped pretending the world would ever get better. It didn't need to. She had learned how to keep it running. Her hair had a few silver threads now, but she wore them like medals, proof of survival. Her arms were still strong, her voice steady as ever. She could still lift a wet linen bundle heavier than most of the footmen, and could still make an entire room of servants go silent with one raised eyebrow. The Fairwick family, on the other hand, was rotting faster than last summer's apples. It began quietly enough, whispered talk among the staff that the Lord had invested poorly. Agnes snorted when she heard it. "Rich folk don't invest poorly," she said. "They just gamble with better handwriting." Then came the creditors, polite at first, then persistent. Coaches arrived in pairs, men in dark coats were shown into the study, and Lady Fairwick started having headaches at an alarming rate. The servants could smell panic long before anyone said the word. Meals shrank, wages arrived late, candles were rationed, the grand piano upstairs went silent, and no one ordered new lace that season. Even the children were quieter, a sure sign the grown-ups were lying. For the staff, life didn't stop, it simply tightened. "Economy," the housekeeper said again, as though it were a new religion. "No waste, no indulgence." Agnes looked at the coarse new soap they'd been issued, cheap stuff that smoked when it boiled. "Aye," she muttered, "no indulgence, unless you count burning skin." The girls laughed weakly. Agnes's humour had become their medicine, bitter, necessary, and more effective than prayer. Hetty the undercook came to her one morning, red-faced and furious. "They've cut the flour again. You can't bake hope, Agnes, not even with the Lord's help." Agnes stirred her vat calmly. "Then make despair. Serve it with gravy. They'll never know the difference." When the manor's debts finally became too public to hide, the upstairs world began to unravel like an old hem. Lady Fairwick stopped coming downstairs altogether. Her husband took to long walks that began at dawn and ended who knows where. Their eldest daughter cried quietly at breakfast, and the youngest developed a cough that seemed timed to interrupt every silence. Through it all, the house still functioned, and because Agnes made it. When the fires burned too low, she stoked them. When deliveries stopped, she scrounged. When the family quarrelled, she made sure no one upstairs had to sleep on unwashed linen, as if clean sheets could hold dignity together. "Keep the laundry moving," she told the girls. "If they smell soap, they'll think they're still respectable." The butler, once puffed up like a peacock, grew pale and jumpy. He started consulting her in whispers. "Mrs. Hurst," he said one night, wringing his hands, "we may lose the household altogether." She shrugged, unbothered. "Then I'll find another with dirty shirts. Can't say the world's running out of those." He blinked at her. "You're remarkably calm. After 30 years of other people's messes," she said, "you stop expecting anything to stay clean." It wasn't that she didn't care. She did, in her own fierce way. She just knew better than to panic over the inevitable. The Fairwicks were falling, but her life didn't hang on their fortune. Hers was built on work, not wealth, and work, unlike fortune, never disappeared. When the scandal finally broke, something about unpaid debts and forged notes, though no one downstairs ever got the full story, the mansion erupted in whispers. A messenger arrived at midnight, pounding on the door. The master locked himself in his study for 2 days, and the lady took to her bed. Agnes heard all of it through the pipes and walls. She didn't need gossip, the laundry told her everything. The sheets came down streaked with tears, the handkerchiefs stiff with brandy, the towels damp with cold sweat. The housekeeper was useless that week, too flustered to organise anyone, so it was Agnes who set things right, again. She took over the daily rota, calmed the maids, and kept the rhythm going. "Keep working," she said. "They'll forget their ruin faster if the floors shine." The others followed her lead without question. When the lady's relatives arrived in mourning clothes, for the family's reputation rather than any actual death, the manor looked spotless. No one upstairs ever realised the reason the household hadn't collapsed was because one laundress refused to. That evening, after the worst had passed, Hetty found her sitting on the washhouse step, hands red, face glowing with the heat of the day. "Tell me true," Hetty said. "You ever wish you'd been born rich?" Agnes looked up at the grey-blue sky, thinking. "No," she said at last. "They don't laugh enough. They've got too much to lose." Hetty grinned. "And we? Oh, we've nothing left to lose. That's freedom with blisters." She spent that night awake, listening to the storm of whispers drifting down from the upper floors, arguments, doors slamming, voices cracking under the weight of humiliation. The sound didn't unsettle her. It was almost comforting. There was something honest about a family finally admitting they were falling apart. She thought, at least they've stopped pretending they're better than soap. The next morning she rose before dawn, same as always, lit the fires, filled the vats, and began her work. Outside, the manor's creditors waited like crows. Inside, the linens still needed washing. And for Agnes Hurst, that was reason enough to carry on. By 61, Agnes Hurst had earned the right to sit down whenever she pleased, though she rarely did. The habit of motion had soaked into her bones. Even when she rested, her hands twitched, searching for a sheet to fold or a sleeve to mend. The other servants whispered that she'd been part of the manor since its foundation. Mrs. Hurst, they joked, came with the bricks. Agnes didn't argue. "And I'll outlast a few of them too," she said dryly, cracking her stiff knuckles. Her hair had gone white at the temples, her skin freckled with old burns and years of steam, but she still moved with the purpose of a woman who'd never learned how to slow down. The housekeeper had changed twice. The Fairwick children had grown and scattered, but Agnes remained, the steady heartbeat under the house's fragile dignity. The scandal of years past had thinned the family's wealth, but they'd managed to limp along. The manor no longer hosted grand dinners or glittering guests. It was quieter now, slower, humbler. Agnes found it suited her. She preferred a house that whispered to one that lied. Her duties had softened some with age. She oversaw the younger girls more than she scrubbed herself, though she still couldn't resist getting her hands in the suds. "Can't trust clean water," she told them. "It's just waiting for trouble." When one of the maids asked if she ever grew tired of washing other people's things, Agnes shrugged. "No," she said. "The day I stop, I'll have to start thinking about my own." Her daughter Clara had married the carpenter years ago. A good man, honest and broad-shouldered, with sawdust always clinging to his sleeves. They'd built a home near the edge of the village and filled it with laughter and noise and eventually children. Agnes had 3 grandchildren now, all of them loud, sturdy, and convinced that their grandmother could fix anything in the world with soap or sarcasm. On Sundays, she visited their cottage carrying small gifts, a jar of sweets, a new apron for Clara, sometimes a bundle of herbs from the manor gardens she still tended in secret. The grandchildren would run to meet her, shouting "Granny Soap," and she'd laugh, pretending to scold them. "That's Mrs. Soap to you, young heathens." They'd tug her toward the fire, climb into her lap, and ask for stories. She never told them about the Fairwicks. She told them about bubbles that floated like ghosts, and boilers that hissed like dragons, and clever washerwomen who outwitted their masters by folding their secrets into sheets. At work, she'd begun to train her replacement, a timid girl named Elsie with clever fingers but no backbone yet. Agnes was patient with her in her own blunt way. "You've got good hands," she said, watching her scrub. "Soft now, but they'll roughen up soon. Every wrinkle's a story, mind you. Just don't collect too many from other people's foolishness." Elsie nodded nervously, wringing her apron. "Do you ever stop caring about it all, ma'am?" Agnes smiled faintly. "No, but you learn not to bleed over it." The Fairwick household had dwindled too. Only Lady Fairwick remained, pale, polite, almost spectral in her mourning silks. The lady had outlived her husband and her fortune, and now lived mostly in her rooms, surrounded by old furniture and older regrets. Sometimes she'd send for Agnes under some pretense, a misplaced handkerchief, a stain that needed the old touch. But really, she just wanted company. "We've both seen better days," she said once, with a brittle smile. "Aye," Agnes replied, "but only one of us remembers how to wash them." Their conversations were quiet, almost gentle. Lady Fairwick asked about Clara, about the grandchildren, about the village. Agnes answered simply. They weren't friends. The distance between them was too great for that. But they shared the strange intimacy of 2 women who had spent their lives pretending not to be tired. Outside the house, the world had changed. There were rumours of machines that could wash faster than 10 women, powered by something called steam. Agnes didn't believe it. If a machine could wash away trouble, she said to Hetty, who now worked in town, the rich would have invented it centuries ago. Still, she knew her time was coming to an end. Her hands hurt in the mornings. Her knees protested when she lifted heavy loads. Sometimes when she bent over a tub, her back would seize, and she'd curse softly in rhythm with the wringer's turn. She'd begun thinking about retirement. The word sounded foreign, like a luxury item, but the thought of stillness frightened her more than exhaustion ever had. "What'll I do with my hands if not this?" she asked Clara once. Her daughter smiled. "Hold your grandchildren, maybe." Agnes considered that, then nodded. "Good. At least they're lighter than linen." Her last year at the manor passed like a slow exhale. She started arriving a little later, leaving a little earlier, and letting Elsie take the lead. She still supervised with the same sharp humour. "Mind that water," she'd say. "It's got no respect for the living." But now there was warmth beneath her wit, a sense of handing over the reins with grace rather than regret. Some days she lingered in the courtyard at dusk, watching the laundry flutter in the breeze, rows of white sheets glowing gold in the low sun. It was the same sight she'd seen for 40 years, but it struck her differently now. The sound of them snapping in the wind was like applause, faint but sincere. When her last week finally came, the staff surprised her with a supper, plain but cheerful. There was stew, cider, and even a cake that leaned slightly to one side. Hetty came down from the village, the new maids wept, and even Lady Fairwick sent down a note of thanks written in a shaky hand. Agnes read it once, then tucked it in her apron pocket. "Nice of her," she said. Shame she didn't discover gratitude when her hands still worked. The next morning she came one final time, not to work, but to walk the halls while they were still hers to walk. The house was quiet, the air thick with the scent of soap, polish, and memory. She touched the corner of the laundry table, the brass latch on the wash-house door, the edge of the old copper vat she'd stirred for half her life. Her reflection in it was rippled and imperfect, which felt exactly right. Then she tied her shawl, stepped out into the bright morning, and began the walk home. The same road she'd walked since she was 17, though this time she carried nothing but her lunch tin and a small piece of lavender she'd plucked from the garden. She wasn't finished, not really, just changing rooms. When evening settled over the village, the air carried that familiar scent of soap and wood smoke, faint now, but still clinging to the edges of Agnes Hurst's world. She sat by her cottage window, the same seat she'd had for years, wrapped in her shawl, watching the last light spill across the fields. The sky was soft and bruised with blue, the kind that looked like rinsed linen left out to dry. Inside, the fire crackled low, patient and steady. Her grandchildren's laughter had already drifted out the door and down the lane, a sound she carried with her long after it faded. The house was quiet now, but not empty. There was the ticking of the old mantel clock, the whisper of wind through the chimney, and the slow rhythm of her own breathing, calm, deliberate, certain. Her hands, still strong though lined with age, rested in her lap. They had known more water, more soap, more work than most lives ever held. She looked at them sometimes and thought of every sheet, every uniform, every handkerchief that had passed through them. Thousands of small, ordinary miracles of cleanliness. Thousands of small, ordinary acts of care. Outside, the moon began to rise, pale and full and impossibly clean. It cast a silvery wash across the yard, across the line where laundry used to hang, across the lavender patch she'd planted long ago. The flowers swayed gently in the night breeze, their scent soft as a memory. She closed her eyes and listened. The world sounded different now. No hissing vats, no shouting, no endless rhythm of folding and rinsing, just stillness and the quiet murmur of life continuing somewhere far away. She imagined the manor at this hour, dimly lit, perhaps sleeping too, the Fairwicks gone, the new owners unaware that the ghosts in that house were not restless spirits, but echoes of old labour, laughter, and soap. Agnes smiled faintly, half asleep. "All clean," she murmured to no one in particular. For once, the day's all clean. Her breathing slowed, matching the faint creak of the cooling fire. The night pressed softly at the window pane, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, then fell silent again. The old woman's head dipped slightly forward, her fingers still curled lightly as if holding some invisible thread. The last piece of a life spun, rinsed, wrung, and hung out under countless skies. And in that quiet, soap-scented air, Agnes Hurst, laundress of Fairwick Manor, wife, mother, grandmother, keeper of order in a world that never stayed clean for long, finally allowed herself to rest. The fire sighed low, the clock ticked on, and everything, the night, the house, the gentle hum of the world, seemed at last perfectly folded